This week's episode of our show has been sponsored by Aurora, Age of Desolation, which is now live on Kickstarter.
Aurora is a new post-apocalyptic campaign setting for 5th edition that implements new subsystems for survival, exploration, and character creation.
To survive the Age of Desolation, great heroes are needed to go out and explore the world of Aurora. And as such, Aurora introduces new mechanical systems for exploration and survival, building on the core mechanics of 5e.
If you've been looking for a way to broaden the scope of the exploration mechanics and the survival aspects of D&D and making those more of a theme in your campaign, then Aurora is the perfect setting for you.
More than that, you can also make characters with a unique combination of ancestral traits prepared to take on this dangerous new world.
So make sure to follow the links below to get all the latest updates on Aurora, Age of Desolation.
And now, on to this episode. Greetings, my name is Monty Martin.
And I'm Kelly McLaughlin.
And we are the Dungeon Dudes. Welcome to our channel where we cover everything D&D, including advice for players and guides for GMs.
We upload new videos on Tuesdays and Thursdays, so please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode.
Today, we are discussing how to create a fantasy city to use in your worlds and games of Dungeons & Dragons.
Some of the most iconic locations in fantasy settings are the great cities that are depicted. We have iconic examples like Waterdeep or the underground city of Menzoberranzan or even Sharn from the Eberron setting. In other settings, we have cities like Minas Tirith from Lord of the Rings or the world-spanning city of Ravnica from Magic the Gathering. A city is much more than just a stopover in your campaign. A city might be a great location for your adventurers to go, to shop, to meet people, to learn about the world, or you could even have an entire adventure or campaign set in a single city.
This video builds on many of the ideas that we discussed in our video on how to create a fantasy town. You can find a link to that right up here. This is because a city is a town taken to a whole other order of magnitude, and we're going to apply some of the principles that we discussed in that video to scale things up to city size, because in many respects, a city is just a really, really, really big town. So if you haven't watched the video, Kelly and I strongly recommend that you pause this video now, go watch that video, and then come back here. We'll be back in a moment.
Now that you've hopefully watched that video, the ideas still remain and the core concepts that we talk about in that video are going to remain here, but we want this video to focus on how to expand on that. Some of the main takeaways from our Creating a Fantasy Town video is that the core questions still remain the same. Questions like, why are your players coming to this location? What are they going to find here? And what are they looking for? Questions like, where can we stay? Where can we shop? And who's in charge around here still matter when we're creating a fantasy city. When we looked at a lot of the lists that we used to create a fantasy town, we're going to use the same types of lists here, but we're going to make them a lot bigger.
Creating a fantasy city can be a daunting task, especially because it can be very easy to either over or under prepare. A fantasy town can work if you just have one shop, one tavern, the mayor's house, plus the temple or church. But what makes a city feel like a city is a coming together of a massive number of people, places, and presenting lots of options to choose from. When the players stop one of the local citizens or ask one of the town guards, where can we go to shop? Where can we go to stay? Instead of getting one answer, they get a couple, colored by the opinion of the person that they're talking to. This makes the city feel like a big place because you're getting that kind of listicle recommendations from the people that live there. It really highlights the idea that there's a lot of things going on. However, fulfilling your end of the bargain and actually designing multiple places for the players to go to and not knowing what choice they're going to make is a really difficult part of making a fantasy city, which is why making a big city is definitely a long-term undertaking.
I think that when we think of the real world, the difference is when you stop in a small town, you often say, hey, where do people go to eat here? When you stop in a city, you say, what's a good place to eat nearby? It's a very different question because a city has many places to eat. A city has many places to stay. And so a lot of these preferences and choices and locations, and depending on where you currently are in the city, all matter. But when we're getting into those types of questions, one of the main things that we might notice when we're in a city is that a city is divided up into neighborhoods or districts. And really, a neighborhood or district in a city is kind of similar to its own little town within a city. One key identification, though, is that oftentimes districts are a little bit more specific. So when somebody asks, hey, what tavern do I want to go to? They might say, oh, there's a whole bunch of taverns over in the tavern district. Or, there might be the Noble Tavern in the Noble District. There might be a tavern in the Church District where a lot of the people who go to the churches go to that tavern. There might be one in the Industrial District, but there might also be an entire street of taverns. So when you're thinking of dividing your city into districts, you can be a little bit more specific with what types of locations are there. But using the same rules as our fantasy town, a city is really just a bunch of districts mashed together.
Ever since I played Civilization 6, which actually has a district-based mechanic for its gameplay, I've used this idea for designing my fantasy cities, thinking about them in terms of specialized districts. And there's lots of different districts that you can have for your cities that are all going to be specialized around a wide range of things. We're going to discuss what some of the possibilities for the different districts in your cities are. But when you are designing your fantasy city, you can decide how many districts it has, what those districts are, and then approach each individual district like it's its own little fantasy town, and give one key location for each of those. In effect, designing a city is kind of like designing somewhere between 3 to 12 towns at once. And on this point, the number of districts that you put in your city should roughly correspond to the population of the city overall. If you have a city of 1 million people, which is huge, especially for pre-industrial societies, although there are historical precedents for it, you will probably have a city that might have dozens of districts and several neighborhoods, maybe even sub-districts. That's a metropolis. But I find a good goal for a typical fantasy city of starting at about 10 to 20,000 people is maybe 3 to 5 districts. And if you're looking for something big that's like 100 or 200,000 people, that's where you might want to consider designing 12 or maybe even 20 districts at the top end. And certainly you can let your districts be a work in progress. There will be some districts that will be very important and you'll want to work on first. We'll discuss what those are. And there's other ones where you can kind of gloss it over or maybe only explore them once you have an adventure set in that area of town.
Another key point about creating districts is also keep in mind that because this is a major city, people can travel from one district to another to get the things that they need. So although we're using the template of our fantasy town multiple times over to create our districts, you can be a little looser with including all of the appropriate buildings in a district. Not every district needs an inn, a tavern, a shop, and a church. One district might have none of the above. It might just be housing and living quarters. And then the people who live there travel one district over to go to the shops. So when you are thinking of your districts, you can be a little looser and think more about where people go in your city to really perform these tasks. Although peppering a few of these options around the city will make it feel more lively.
Creating your city in districts also makes them much easier to map, especially if you don't consider yourself to have a lot of artistic talent or aren't interested in using software tools to do this. Because what you can basically do with districts is get either a grid or a hex grid and circle which districts are which. And so you'll have a rough understanding of how they fit together. Each district can occupy either one square of your grid or one hex of your map, or you could vary it, having certain districts being larger and smaller than others. And then I like to take that and then put it into other mapping programs to think about it. As an example, we'll put this up on screen. This was the hex grid that I used when thinking about Drakkenheim. Obviously, things changed a little bit when we have the real map of the city, but as things evolved, this was how I thought about it when I was designing the city. Or you can just grab a piece of paper and circle a bunch of blobs and connect them together, and that'll even give you the idea for how the roadways might connect between the districts, and even give you an idea of if you want to place a river that runs through your city, or place it on the edge of a coast. Obviously, that's going to help you inform where certain districts might be, because the docks district is going to be on the coast, and maybe the industrial district wants to be on the river so that it has access to the water to power water wheels.
And speaking of that, let's give a brief example of some of the districts that you can use. Keep in mind that this is not an exhaustive list. We are in a magical setting, and you could come up with any number of things that a district symbolizes. But here's some of the key options that we think are pretty important and readily available to use.
I think the first one is the market district. Cities are hubs for trade. That's a big reason why they come into existence in the first place. And if there's any one district that I would probably consider mandatory for every city, is the market district. A giant open-air market where people from the surrounding towns and villages can bring their goods in during the day to sell them, but then there will also be more permanent shops and other establishments all around. Oftentimes, market districts are at the heart of the city on major thoroughfares, near gateways. They're usually the most well-patrolled by guards, and it's the hub, the hustle, the bustle. It's the part of the city that feels like the city.
It's also probably the number one place that your players are going to be asking about when they arrive in the city. Cities often have the option to buy better equipment, magical items, maybe even potions and scrolls that aren't available in the smaller towns. So the market district, being the place to shop, is the best place for them to get their hands on these items. Also in the heart of your city, you might come across the Old Town District. The Old Town District is usually where the city started. It's humble beginnings where you will find older buildings, administrative offices, and probably some of the capital buildings of the entire city. It might include some older housing, or maybe even be near the Nobles District. Either way, the Old Town is kind of the heart of a lot of cities, and often includes historical landmarks and sites for people to come and see. Maybe where fairs or shows are put on, drawing people towards the center heart of where your city is.
Cities often are placed in strategic locations and often have their own guards or armies associated with them. And what great fantasy city is complete without a castle of some kind? This is where the military quarter, or you might call the citadel or the castle, comes into play. This is a part of the city where there is a large fortification built. It might even be very closely associated with the Old Town, because perhaps the castle was there first, then the Old Town sprung up around the castle, and then the city radiated out from there. Such that sometimes the castle might not be in the best position for the city's defenses overall anymore, because of the way the city grew up around the castle. Sometimes the defenses might be outside the city, particularly if it's more of a military base or an army encampment. But cities need defenders, and in addition to the city walls that may or may not surround the city, and the gates themselves of the city, these will often form some sort of network or connection between the castle or the citadel, the fortifications, and all those things that protect the city overall.
Now, oftentimes, cities spring up near bodies of water. It's one of the resources, ways of travel, trade. It's very important to most civilizations to have fresh water. So your city's probably near a body of water, and therefore might have a docks district. Now, the docks district is where boats are coming in for trade or possibly for travel, and also oftentimes associated with fishing, fisheries, or anything else water and seafaring. Maybe whalers or even the Navy all use the dock district. Now, the dock district is usually going to be near the market district and kind of maybe even a subsection of that. The market district is where all the fun shopping happens, but it's a quick jaunt down to the docks district to grab your fish and other goods that are just coming in fresh off of the trade boats.
A docks district will often have many warehouses used to store the goods that are either coming or going from the ports proper. And this is also where you're going to find a lot of those salty, seedy taverns populated by sailors, where it's a perfect place to have the really rough and tumble taverns where you can sing a sea shanty and quaff back a pint of ale.
Now, as well, most cities manufacture some sort of goods, and this is where the industrial district is going to come into play. The industrial district of your city, in its location, can actually be a really mixed bag depending on what it is that your city is known for producing. If your industrial district includes factories blowing out smoke and steam all the time, it might not be near where people live. But there are many other manufacturing options that might be right in the heart of the city, right next to the commercial areas, or right next to the residential areas. The industrial district is going to be putting out a lot of the items that are maybe for sale in your market district, or that people will want to trade. And many of the people that live in the city might need to travel to the industrial district for work.
Although the notion of a factory can feel like a very modern idea, there have been many cities throughout history that have been famous for their manufactured goods. These can be things like smelting to make steel and finished weapons. But the city of Alexandria was known for its glass-making industry. And other cities might be well known for making textiles, clothing, finished goods, jewelry, pottery, or things like tannery and leatherworking goods. Oftentimes, industrial districts need a lot of energy, which ironically means that industrial districts are usually along waterways, like a river, because if you're dealing with a pre-industrial society, they often will use things like water wheels and windmills to power their machinery. And straight up, they might be using the waterway to bring in the goods themselves. A great example of this is lumber, which often it's easier for pre-industrial societies to send wooden logs down a river to be processed in a lumber mill. Also, industrial districts are going to produce a lot of waste, and oftentimes the most convenient place to put that is in the river. This is not necessarily one of the pleasant elements of cities, but an industrial district is a reminder that cities smell. Cities create pollution. Cities create waste. And so part of the reason why an industrial district might exist is managing things like the flow of water and waste through your city. And this is where we might be thinking about the subterranean district of our city, the sewers themselves. It's worth noting that with a sewer system, it's important to distinguish between a freshwater system that brings water that brings drinking water and bathing water into the city. This is what we might call an aqueduct, and something that is a drain that gets rid of wastewater and puts that out of the city. It's very important that those systems do not overlap one another. You don't want your fresh water getting mixed up with your wastewater.
As we move through the most important elements of our city, there's usually going to be a temple district. A lot of faithful people gravitate towards a city. What faiths are worshipped in your city? Is it multiple? Is it just one? There might be an entire district dedicated to churches, cathedrals, catacombs, mosques, temples, any sort of religious site, or multiple religious sites of different gods, deities, and places of worship. Oftentimes, these districts are quite lavish and beautiful. They might be near gardens or be filled with trees and places for people to walk and sit and enjoy the view of the great buildings, because usually temples and the sort are some of the most iconic and beautiful buildings that you will find in a city.
In addition to grand high temples and great cathedrals, most cities will have way more places of worship than you actually think they will. This is one of those kind of blind spots, I think, that happens in a lot of fantasy books, where usually there is one temple to each god of the fantasy pantheon, but in reality, there's probably going to be multiple, particularly if these are religions where people gather on holy days and on a regular basis. It's totally okay to say that there are countless numbers of smaller churches, shrines, and temples throughout the residential districts of your city, and having a lot of churches or temples or shrines throughout your city is a great way to really make it feel like a lived-in and diverse sort of place, with people of many different backgrounds and religions and schools of thought coming together in different ways. Of course, if you have a setting that is less religiously diverse, perhaps even monotheistic, there will still be tons and tons of these churches, and oftentimes there will be sub-neighborhoods that might even be built around individual churches.
Now, obviously, the most important people in the city need a place to live, and of course that place to live needs to be nicer and more elegant than all of the other places to live in the city, and this is where you're going to get a nobles district. The nobles district is usually going to be the richest part of the city. Your noble district is probably going to be in the most desirable land in the city. Oddly enough, might not be near the water though, because they are going to want to avoid the docks district and the industrial district. Although ocean view housing might sound like a treat, that might not be the ideal place for your nobles to live.
The noble district of your city might even be more on the edge of the city, or perhaps even outside the city walls proper, so that the nobles can have large estates and large properties. They might even have their own private businesses out there, like vineyards. It's not uncommon for nobles to prefer to not live inside the city proper, but then they might have just a house or an apartment that they keep in the city when they need to travel in there, and then have their own personal manor or estate outside the city itself. Nevertheless, there will be a population of nobles and wealthy people that are in the city, and with wealth often comes an interest in some of the finer things in life. Things like entertainment. And this is where your city might even have a dedicated entertainment district of some kind, and this can take a lot of different shapes depending on the tastes and culture of the people that inhabit your world. For some cities, they might have a vibrant theater district. Others might have a brutal arena like the Colosseum or the Circus Maximus. And others still might have beautiful gardens that are in the middle of the city, perhaps even an exotic zoo that is furnished by the monarch.
Between your theater districts, garden districts, or any other great events that you put into your city, this is going to draw crowds. This is going to draw not only the nobles, but people traveling to the city often will go to see the Colosseum or the great theater that holds the most prestigious plays, or the beautiful lavish garden that is full of exotic trees and plants for people to explore and enjoy. Oftentimes, cities will aim to show off these districts and put them on the main roads through the city, rather than showing off the docks or the slums.
And that is another district in itself that can happen in your city. Either a slum or a shanty town, or somewhere where the poor and disenfranchised people of your city, and a city will have a lot of them, have their homes. These poorer regions of your city will often be in the places that are very inconvenient and not very nice. They will be the residential areas that are right beside the industrial district or right beside the docks. People live here not because they want to, but because there's nowhere else for them to go.
And in that case, the people living in the slums are oftentimes the ones who work the odd jobs at the docks or in the industries. Pulling in just enough coin to maintain that lifestyle and live within the city walls. Oftentimes, living within the city walls is a blessing itself, so being able to afford any housing in there is sometimes great enough.
And finally, your city may have several residential districts. This is a great way to make a city feel very, very large, but I would definitely say that when it comes to residential districts, oftentimes adventurers have the least reasons to go to these places. So usually I will just create a bunch of residential districts, name them, and leave it at that. Because unless you're doing something very special with those residential districts, it's a great way to just create the impression of many neighborhoods where people live. Obviously there will be shops, obviously there will be smaller marketplaces and smaller temples in these residential districts, but they're kind of just placeholders to make the city feel large. That said, you could choose to have a residential district or even an industrial or commercial district that has a little bit more of a flavor to it, such as having a dwarven district or an elven district, or one that is based around a group of people that live there that might somehow be that might form their own sub-community for a variety of reasons. Much in the same way that Toronto has Chinatown, Little Italy, and Greek Town, your fantasy city might have the Halfling Town, and it might have the Gnomeville within the city itself. And these cities can almost be little microcosms of their own.
Either way, if you're a fan of playing games like Sim City or City Skylines, you probably have a much better idea of how these things lean into each other and flow, and how important it is to structure your city with industrial, commercial, and residential areas that all take into account their location and how they feed into each other.
This can feel like a lot. And certainly it is a big list. When you are prioritizing which districts of your city to develop, though, you really do want to ask yourself the question, why might the adventurers go here? If you don't have a good reason for that yet, it's actually okay to simply name the district, write one sentence about it, and leave it at that. And focus on the more central districts where you do have a good reason for your player characters to go to. It is okay for your city to develop and grow over time.
If this city is just a stopping point for your players on a great adventure, you might just need the shops, the inns, and the taverns figured out. Maybe who the monarch is. But if this city is going to be your entire campaign or the site of multiple adventures, that's when you're going to want to start fleshing it out in great detail and figure out all the moving parts of that city. But regardless of all the districts that we have, there's still some glue that needs to tie all of these elements together. And that's usually going to be the government and the guard. Every city has a central authority and somebody to uphold the law. Oftentimes, this is going to include a monarch, a king, lord, duke, or some figure of that sort, as well as a city guard or a city military. There might be a full army, there might just be a group of guards, there might be both who have different jobs within the city. Your guards might be the ones who patrol the streets, while there is a military camp that prepares for outgoing wars.
Of course, the governmental authority could be democratically elected, and it's not uncommon for many cities. They might have a ruler, like a monarch or a duke or a baron, but then they might also have a lord mayor who is elected and forms a town council of some kind to help run the administrative affairs. One of the other big forces that can be at play in the authority of your city can actually be the guilds that arise around the industry as well. And oftentimes there might be a jostling for power or priority between the military forces of the city, the guilds of the city, the council of the city, and the ruler of the city. This can be a really interesting opportunity for a faction-based adventure, and you might even design your factions around the various guilds, the various representatives of various districts that are elected to the town council, the ruler and the nobles that live in the district, as well as the military forces of the city itself. It's a great way to create an interesting dynamic that your player characters can interact with in a meaningful way, and of course, don't forget to add the criminals that inhabit the city, who will be inevitably there, as another force to complicate matters. Because cities have their law, but they also have lots of ways to escape the law as well.
So either way, if you take the elements that we spoke about in our Creating a Fantasy Town, pair them with the idea of expanding this into districts, how your city is going to work together, an established guard, an established leader, and glue it all together into your now beautiful city. The other main thing to consider, again, is why your players are coming here. A city might be a great opportunity to buy rare and expensive materials, magic items, potions, scrolls, or equipment. It might also be a great place to host events, fairs, attractions, and gatherings of people. There might be a special event happening at the nearby city that your party is traveling to partake in. Cities are places where power, wealth, and a concentration of people all gather together. So that also means that many important people are going to live in a city. Maybe your player characters are traveling here to meet a very special noble, or even a member of the church, or a specific wizard or mage. They could be traveling to the city because this is where those important people operate, and this is where they make their living.
Don't forget to leave room for the fantastic as well when you are designing your cities. A great example of this is you might have a magic district in your city, particularly if you have a high magic setting, where a magical university or a mage school has been created. This is a great spin on a campus district or a library district. That is another type of place of learning that could exist within your cities as well. You could have a city that is near a fantastical magical resource, or some other sort of magical force that shapes the landscape in some sort of way. Or where there are great legends of heroes, or one that is patrolled by guards riding on wyverns or even dragons. Having that magical element that really defines your city and makes it into a special place is another thing that really helps make the city memorable. And I find that it's really worthwhile looking at pictures and images of cities from history and ultimately traveling. Because I found that when designing fantasy cities, for me, the biggest inspiration that I ultimately come to are the cities that I visited as when I've had the opportunity to travel. They stick with you, and it's totally okay to riff on a real world city if you're short of ideas. There are so many cities and there are so many recognizable things that if you want to just say, you know what, the cathedral that is in my city is basically Notre Dame. Or if you want to say that, you know what, I'm going to have a magical mage tower in my city that's kind of like a reference to the Chrysler Building or the CN Tower. Or I want to have the Colosseum or the Sky Dome. Or you know what? I'm just going to put Hogtown into this place. It's totally okay to borrow real world things. Maybe you've got Broadway or Fifth Avenue or Central Park or the Berlin Zoo. Any of those big things that you love from real world cities, just take them and put them into your city.
I agree with you, and I think as a final note, it's really important that you think of one iconic thing that separates your city from every other city. A monument, a statue, a location, an event, something that is iconic, and in most of our fantasy worlds, something fantastical. When we were working on Drakkenheim, one of the big questions was, what was the view of the city from a nearby hilltop? What things stuck out? And I mean literally. The buildings that make you go, I want to visit those locations and that giant crater in the ground. Those are the most important places that I want to see. And then you've set up places for your adventures to take place and for your players to get excited about visiting. This has been a look at building fantasy cities in Dungeons & Dragons. Tell us about some of the great and iconic fantasy cities that you've created in the comments below.
The videos that we create on our channel are made possible thanks to the incredible generosity of our Patreon supporters. If you enjoy the work that we do here on YouTube, please consider joining our communities by following the link in the description below.
And if you want to see a fantasy city in play, you can check out our adventures in a ruined fantasy city in the Fate of Drakkenheim, which airs Tuesday nights on Twitch. You can find all the previous episodes right up over here.
And we've got plenty more videos for advice for Dungeon Masters right up over here.
Please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode.
Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you next time
in the dungeon.